Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Andrew Olsen is a best-selling author, popular podcaster, speaker, and nonprofit marketer who has guided over 500 nonprofits in raising more than $500 million. Over the years, he has built and led fundraising programs on behalf of organizations ranging from Covenant House International to Care USA and dozens of rescue missions and food banks across the U.S. and Canada. Today, he serves as Senior Vice President of Fundraising Solutions at DickersonBakker Associates, leading the firm's major gift consulting practice, overseeing the impact messaging division, and responsibilities for developing and launching new products and services for the firm. In our conversation, he takes us on the journey from the rough neighborhood and tough times of his LA childhood to today, where he lives on a farm in Tennessee with his family and menagerie of 227 animals and counting. So we'll begin by just asking you the big question, which is, where are you coming from? You told me a bit about that earlier, about growing up in the city. Is that right?
Yeah, so I grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles area. From the time I was born there and until I was late 20s, grew up in that area, all throughout really the San Gabriel Valley, so Pasadena, El Monte, that kind of area of Los Angeles, and have moved around the country, travel a lot for work. Lived for about 16 years in Minneapolis and lived through a lot of snow and a lot of cold weather. And then a couple of years ago, actually in the middle of the pandemic, my wife and I looked at each other as the snow was falling and people were stuck in their houses and we couldn't let our kids out the door. And we said, what are we doing? Like, this is stupid. Let's go somewhere where it's warmer and we can at least be outside. So we migrated down to Knoxville, Tennessee. That's where we are now.
Why Knoxville?
We had some good friends that lived in Knoxville, and we would come down for about 5 years. We would make the trip down from Minnesota to Tennessee to spend a week with them, week and a half, something like that. And we just really enjoyed how open it was. We like the mountains, but we don't want like constant snow. So being at the foothills of the Smokies was really attractive to us. And so that's what brought us down here.
It's a big world of difference between LA, Minnesota, and Tennessee. So go back a little bit to growing up in LA. Again, LA is a big place. And for those who don't know it, what was it like where you grew up?
Yeah, it is very different from the other places where I have lived and do live now. So I grew up, my wife and I joke about this. She's also from Southern California, but we literally lived on opposite sides of the tracks in every sense of the word. The areas that I lived were much more riddled with poverty. We grew up pretty poor. I grew up in a couple of neighborhoods that were fairly gang infested, where we had drive-by shootings on our street fairly regularly. My little sister actually was about 10 feet from a woman who was shot in a drive-by. So that's the kind of neighborhood that I grew up in. A community where, and I think so many people who are immigrants to this country experience this, but I experienced it backwards, right? I grew up on a couple of different blocks where I was the only kid who spoke English. And so to play with the other kids in the neighborhood, I had to develop the broken Spanish that I probably still have. It's even worse now. But just that little bit to be able to communicate with kids in the neighborhood. So that's the area in Los Angeles where I came from, where I grew up. And so that is, you're right, very different from either Minneapolis or Knoxville.
How did your family end up in that particular neighborhood in LA?
So, when I was telling the story yesterday to Kevin Fitzpatrick on the One Visit Away show, when I was a teenager, so let me back up a little bit. We ended up there because that's what we could afford, right? My dad was a minister. And so, if you know much about ministry organizations, they don't tend to pay a lot. And the churches that he worked with tended to be in a little more kind of impoverished areas, smaller churches, more community based, not big, ministries. And my mom was a teacher's assistant, and that's, it's one of those hourly jobs that at the time probably paid like $7 to $10 an hour sort of thing. So they weren't wealthy. And that meant that we found housing in the neighborhoods that we could afford. And on top of that, we ended up discovering that my father had a gambling addiction. And so at one point we lost everything. We became homeless. And that meant that we further, kind of went deeper into more impoverished communities where housing was even cheaper and where government assistance was more readily available. And we were able to make ends meet in places that, I certainly don't wish on my kids or anybody else's.
That must have left a huge impression, not only on your life, but also on your relationships with family and the things that your family did when you were growing up, including your faith-based relationships. Where are your parents today? So
my dad passed a few years ago, and my mom is now a teacher in Montgomery, Alabama. And you're right, it changed everything. And it also, I was listening, I think, to John Maxwell a couple of days ago, and there was this quote that he said that really hit me. It said, sometimes we view things in our lives that happen as setbacks when really they're just setups for something better. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that in this context, and the idea that so much of what I experienced growing up, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people in our sector, but so much of what I experienced growing up actually put me on the path to really have a deeper understanding of what it means to be in the shoes of the people that a lot of our nonprofit partners serve, and really kind of set the trajectory for my entire career, my entire focus to help raise money for organizations that serve primarily people who live in poverty.
Right. Well, you were living in a community where you saw those needs, but it sounds like your parents in their own ways were also addressing those needs, that certainly with work in the ministry or teaching the school,
for sure,
that's a life of service.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and extended family, we've got sheriff's deputies, paramedics. I mean, a lot of family members who serve in the military. So that kind of service is very common across our entire family.
And then, in terms of your education, when you left there, did you leave kind of intentionally? Some people go off to school, to college, and they think, I'm going to go as far away as possible. But others stick close to home, especially when a family has gone through kind of a collective challenge. So what kind of choice did you make, and how did you make it?
So I did end up almost as far away as I could have, but it was less by intention and more by luck or grace or some other determining factor. So what happened was at that time, we still were kind of deeply in poverty. My parents had separated and divorced at that point, and the only thing that I expected was that I probably would only be able to afford college if I went into the military and used government benefits in order to pay for college after the fact. So I was weeks away from enlisting, and my mother came to me and in tears said, I found this college that I think might give you a scholarship because it's affiliated with the Congregational Church, which is the type of church that my father had pastored. Mm-hmm. And she said, if you really want to go get shot overseas somewhere, could you at least give this a try first and get an education? And then if you still want to do that, you can go, and for me, it wasn't really about like, hey, I want to go be in the military. It was more of, this is a means to an end in a way, the only way I could think of that I can get an education. So fast forward, I went through an application process with the college, and lo and behold, they didn't just offer me a scholarship. They offered to cover everything, all of my tuition, all room and board, books, everything. And so, I kind of looked in the mirror and thought, well, it would be incredibly stupid to say no to that in favor of doing something else. And if somebody's going to offer you completely free for your education, you better jump at it. So that's how I ended up in the Northeast Georgia mountains, going to school, going to college out there.
Is that Piedmont?
It is, yes.
Now, again, that's one of those framing experiences. As you said, it really informs what we do, how we think about things. So when you were offered a full ride, and my wife had one too. So I know that was a huge experience for her, and it really frames how she thinks about her relationship to education, other students, the school, et cetera. How did you react to that initially, besides seeing it as a way to not necessarily go into the military, but go and get education? What do you think now as you think about that kind of offer?
I think about this every once in a while, and I wish that I had been in a better, sort of more grown up mindset then. I mean, obviously I took advantage of it. I went and I did 4 years, and I graduated with a pretty decent GPA. And, but I think I was dealing with so many other things at that point that I sort of just went through the motions to get through school so that I could get out and get a job. And I think there probably were a lot of missed opportunities for me. I had no complaints. I did well, and I've been very successful after the fact. But I think I probably didn't appreciate all of that context as much as I could have.
It sounds like you have an appreciation for it now.
For sure. Yeah.
And you were studying what at that time? Was that religion, philosophy? What were you?
So I started as a psych major.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And, but you know how it is, like, I don't know what the statistic is. I think I've heard people say, kids these days change majors, 5 to 7 times before they graduate or something like that. I started a psychology major, did my first year, with that focus, had some great classes, but I ran into this group of people that were outside one day, on a professor's home's patio at his home, and they just looked like they were having a great conversation and really engaged. And I thought, that's the kind of community that I'd like to be a part of. And went over and had a conversation with them, and it turned out they were the philosophy club. And so, a couple of days later, I kept thinking about it. And I thought, I think I'm just going to change my major. So I transferred my approach, and I moved off of psychology and joined the philosophy and religion major, and went through the rest of my college career studying that, and graduated with that bachelor's degree and then a minor in psychology.
People talk a lot about psychology in our field, and I know we'll talk more about your professional life in just a second, but I imagine that when you're thinking about the philosophy of things, why we do things, and then the psychology of things, how people think about things, there must actually be a lot of relationships between those, especially in your work.
There are, I like so many people in our sector, like I never intended to do this work. I didn't go to school planning to be a fundraiser or work with nonprofits. I didn't honestly, I think at that point even know they existed. But more and more, I see the crossover every day in the value of understanding human behavior, mm-hmm. and in being able to look at situations in a multidimensional way and process information based on understanding of different worldviews and things like that. There's quite a level of crossover between philosophy, psychology, and what's done in the nonprofit sector.
Well, and then we have religion as a huge pillar as well. And
absolutely.
Discussion all the time about how our relationship to faith, both informal and formal, it does influence whether or not we give and how we ask and all these other things. Are these influences from that early education? It sounds like early in your life, still big pieces of your life and your work?
They are. I am still to this day a person of faith, and we worship regularly in a community here. So there's that. There's the formal study of religion that was pretty helpful in kind of grounding me in how communities of faith and people of faith think and process information. And then there's just the other side of it, of like being a pastor's kid, right? Like I grew up in the church and didn't even understand that it was the same thing. But, I can remember the stewardship sermons and the way that those conversations are structured, and you invite a congregation to give and to invest in the church community and things like that. So I think at one point or another, I've probably drawn on all those different experiences to shape the work that I do. I just had no idea back then that they were even a thing,
Right. And now you were there, but I saw something interesting in your professional history that not long afterwards that you went and took a certificate from Berkeley, which is on the other side of the country. I know it brings you back to California, but for those who don't know, that area is very different from LA. And you did it in political campaign management, which, at least for a lot of people at a distance, politics seems so different from the world of kind of the purity of religious and philosophical inquiry. What was that about? And is politics a feature of some of your thinking and your work?
It's yes. It's funny that you bring that up. I would say politics and religion and philosophy are not as far disconnected as people might think, particularly when we get into the psychology of things. So at that point, yes, I was very interested. I had done a good bit of study while I was in college related to international relations and geopolitics, and had a really just fascinating professor who was a retired Marine Corps Judge Advocate General who had been all over the world and was able to connect the dots on how countries relate to one another and how peoples from various countries relate to one another as within the context of political organizations and things like that. So I was interested in it from that perspective. But when I started my career in fundraising at Russ Reed, one of my colleagues, her husband was headed up one of the major political parties in the state of California. And so I got connected into that Berkeley program through him, and ended up that actually, I left Russ Reed after 5 years. And the next job that I took was actually at a political consulting firm. It's what took me to Minnesota. And that certificate program was sort of the foundational first experience in that launched the next 3 years of my career, raising money for political organizations and candidates.
Okay, so it sounds like that's where you really got your fundraising start. Is that right? In political fundraising? For
sure. And it's certainly where I learned the tenets and the tools around high dollar fundraising and dealing with high net worth donors and things of that nature. The consulting firm was primarily a direct response telephone fundraising firm, but a lot of the work we did was with donors who were giving, $5, $10, $15, $25,000 at a clip, which is much different than the traditional sort of, $35, $50 donor.
Yes, it is. And in fact, one of the things that people talk about, again, at a distance, maybe not knowing it as you do, is that there's a transactionality about most of political fundraising, those smaller gifts, that is similar in some respects to the way many nonprofits will treat, more modest level donors. And people wonder, what is causing a diminishment of donors for philanthropy? And is it in part maybe the way that they're treated? You mentioned this word stewardship. It sounds like even with the political, you were focusing on stewardship, because if you're dealing with big dollar donors in politics, that has to be relationship based, isn't it?
A lot of it is. I mean, and I'll say this, in the political arena, even at the highest levels, there is much more of a transactional nature to the relationship than not. Mm-hmm. Certainly more so than in a nonprofit organization. I mean, even some of the biggest donors that I ever interacted with, or our clients interacted with, there was still much more of a sort of quid pro quo relationship in a political operation than there is in a nonprofit. It's almost, when you think about it, if I'm giving to a political committee or a campaign or a candidate, there's a very discrete transfer of value, right? I'm giving you this money and I'm expecting you to fight against this or fight for that or go accomplish this thing from a policy perspective. And oftentimes I'm also expecting to trade access for that contribution. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the big reasons why people get involved financially in giving to political campaigns and committees, because of that opportunity to create access. So there's a lot of that, but it is very much more so relationally driven than what you might experience in low dollar fundraising programs for nonprofit organizations. And I do think I agree with you. I think a big part of why we're seeing the decline in giving right now, I mean, some of it is purely financial, I think, but the other piece of it that is a significant contributor is that we've spent a whole long time and a whole lot of effort and money to teach donors to give transactionally rather than to engage relationally.
There's a lot that I want to talk about with you, but I want to ask you why that is so.
Why? Which part is so?
Why is it that we have been working to essentially train the people who love the same things we do to interact with us just in a transactional way?
Yeah, I don't know that, I don't think there was a grand design around that, right? I don't think a cohort of nonprofit leaders got together and said, how do we cause people not to actually build relationship with us? I don't think it was that. Right. But, if I look back 50, 60 years and I mentioned that I started my fundraising career at Russ Reed. Russ was an actual human being, a great guy. And he's, kind of made direct response fundraising for, at least for ministries and similar organizations, put it on the map with the idea that why is it that a commercial company like Coca-Cola or Pepsi can, have this, high level marketing that causes millions of people to buy their product, and we can't have something similar to solve the world's biggest problems, right? Mm-hmm. So Russ went about with some others, key leaders in the industry all across the country, in the US and Canada, actually. And they started doing things that were very similar to for-profit marketing on behalf of nonprofits. So they started running space ads in newspapers and raising money by telling people, a very simple, hey, there's a homeless person on the streets of Los Angeles, and for $1.97, you can provide a meal and a night of shelter, something like that, right? That fundraising offer is still in use today. And it's in use today because it still produces transactional gifts. And so I think what happened, and I talk to ministry leaders all the time and other nonprofit leaders, and I'll ask them, why don't you have a major gift program? And they'll say things to me like, well, I just never had to build one because the revenue was so good and I didn't have to add headcount when I outsourced all of this to a direct marketing agency, right? So why would I undertake that effort if I was still producing good revenue and I didn't have to add costs? Why would I? And so I think for a lot of organizations, it's simply the fact that it's really easy to do the things that produce transactional results, and not have to think about, not just adding the cost of the headcount and managing the staff, but also, as the leader, then you have to be committed to relationship development and to being front and center and present with donors on an ongoing basis. And then you get into the psychology of, soliciting and having to deal with the angst of putting yourself out there and making an ask and getting a no. And does that no mean that they hate me? Does it mean that they don't believe in our mission? Does it mean that I'm bad at this job? I mean, there's so many different things that get tied up in that for many organizations, I think they just said, you know what, that sounds really hard and really kind of painful. Why would I want to do that when I can just write a check and have somebody else do the work for me? And yeah, it'll be less efficient, but everything else will be easier, and I can focus on the stuff that I actually enjoy, which is managing the program and dealing with the service recipients and doing those things that don't feel as emotionally risky to me.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, here's the funny thing. I built my career on direct response marketing. I've worked in 4 or 5 direct response agencies. I've done direct mail, DRTV, email campaigns. I mean, all those things that are transactional, right? But But a number of years ago, I started to really kind of feel conflicted about this, because I believe that there's a better way to do things, and as part of what prompted my move to DickersonBakker over the last 90 days is that I've just come to the realization that if we want to accomplish big vision and big mission and really move the needle on things like solving the homelessness crisis and ending human trafficking and dealing with hunger and poverty and cancer and all these things, we have to stop just kicking the can, and we have to stop being okay with a 2.5 or a 3-to-1 return on investment and just doing a little better every year. And we've got to rethink the entire way that we approach the donor engagement if we really want to bring people along in their generosity and encourage transformational giving that allows us to accomplish our mission. We've got to behave differently. And it's got to start, I think, with guys like me.
There's a lot to unpack there. And one of the things that you talked about earlier when you talked about Russ Reed is this recognition that in the corporate world, brand was dominant, that you could build a relationship with, let's say, Coke, and it's have a Coke and a smile, or, I'm trying to think of the things I grew up hearing. And even though you might have been purchasing something that's transactional, you felt like, oh, I'm a Coke person versus a Pepsi person, or it might be the same with shoes, right? Versus, I don't know, Vans versus Nike or something like that. And I'm wondering, have we been able to accomplish that on, this is not a great way to think about it, but on the bottom half of the pyramid, or have we been only about the dollars?
Yeah, I think largely we have not been able to accomplish it. And we've really only been about the dollars. And I think there are probably a few organizations that are doing this well. But when you talk to donors, and you survey them and you ask about charitable brands and you ask about, the organizations they give to, I don't know if you've had conversations like that with donors, but oftentimes the donors don't even know who it is that they gave to, right? They might say, oh, I gave to the local food pantry. And in reality, maybe they did, but maybe they gave to a different organization. Maybe they gave to the Lutheran Social Services, or maybe they gave to Catholic Charities, or any number of different organizations. So I think there's not been the kind of brand advocacy in the nonprofit sector that creates the kind of connection that you're talking about to a commercial entity. I mean, I think about, if you are an Apple, a Mac user versus a PC user, there's like a bright line between those two things. There's no confusion. Nobody sits down and goes, oh, I'm going to open my Mac. Oh, it's actually a PC. Like that just doesn't happen. Right. But if I were to put 7 direct mail packages in front of you that are all for similar type organizations, and you had donated to one, it would probably take you 20 minutes to figure out which one you actually gave to.
But we don't have that confusion with universities.
No, for sure not. Nor for many healthcare organizations.
Right.
But I think there's 2 reasons for that, right? So the first is that the people who donate to those organizations had a personal, meaningful, and often long-term relationship with the organization before it ever became a philanthropic engagement. And 2, both of those types of organizations start with the end in mind, and the end is the relationship, right? They don't begin the conversation with a transaction. Largely, like, there probably are some that do, and I put them in a different category, but most of the eds and meds really understand at their core that relationship changes everything. And if they invest in the relationship, the revenue will flow from that.
I wonder if it's possible, even if we don't have the benefit of 4 years hanging out in the dorms and dating and taking classes with professors we loved and hated and all those other things that we know from school, or getting the care at a hospital, or watching a loved one receive care, that even if we don't have the benefit of that experience, if it's possible to replicate the other element, it's something that over time we build a relationship, then we start asking, but we ask in a way that models on their experience versus our needs. Is that something that you find other organizations able to do?
I think so. You know, what's interesting to me is the times where I find this most often are in some of the smallest charities. And it's because they're still able to get really close to their donors because they have fewer donors. And so they're able to build a more meaningful relationship often because of that ability to be proximate with those donors. And they, you know, I think one of the challenges is when you hit a certain scale organizationally, you start to build in the bureaucracy that pushes you away from the donor. And because you're looking to build efficiency, right? And you're looking to grow faster. And the only way to do those things at an acceptable return on investment is to operationalize them and to mechanize them in a way that that pushes the donor outside in the conversation. And so I often see that some of the best examples of kind of building that continuity and that relationship outside of education and medicine are in organizations that are still what most in our sector would refer to as grassroots. Right. But I think we have a lot to learn from those small organizations. Often, you know, you go to a conference or something, you'll hear people talk about, well, you know, it's not really for small organizations. We're bigger, so we have different issues and things like that. And I think if we get a little bit, you know, outside of ourselves and not be so arrogant, we could look at some of those smaller organizations and realize, wow, you know, they may only have 250 donors, but they've built really deep relationships and they certainly have things to learn and, you know, needs that are different, but we could also learn something about how to continue to manage relationships from folks like that. I also think organizations that have significant volunteer engagement, I see those organizations often doing this better because they are building that pipeline for giving out of the volunteer experience, or out of, you know, maybe not even volunteer, but some other, you know, rather than acquiring a donor through traditional acquisition and you know, getting that first transaction, organizations that are bringing people into relationship through content marketing and two-way conversations and things of that nature. I think those are the kind of organizations long-term that are probably going to be able to do this better and build deeper relationships that eventually lead to more transformational giving because they're not starting the relationship off just setting the tone for small dollar transactional engagement.
Right, because that's just about the money. It's not about the people.
Exactly.
What's interesting about that is that you've built a lot of your professional life on direct response. And when people think about direct response, at least when I do, I think volume and metrics. Right. But you've just made this great argument for focus on maybe a smaller number of more substantial relationships that also have the benefit of bringing us potentially more revenue. You're not saying don't pay attention to other people. You're just saying pay more attention to a smaller group of people. Is that right?
It's absolutely right. You know, I think, and yeah, I mean, you know, for many years of my career, I was managing really large marketing programs and, you know, sometimes millions of donor records. And there's no way for an organization to build relationships at that scale. You'd have to hire hundreds of fundraisers and the cost on that is exponential. You know, but if we really want to do this well, and we really want to create an atmosphere where donors can actually give their best gifts, we have to focus on relationships and we have to also spend the majority of our time with the people who can give the most significant gifts. You know, it's not maybe a popular thing to say because there's definitely a populist undertone right now. And, you know, I hear a lot of people talking about, you know, you need to treat every donor equally. And I get that to an extent, but we have to be realists as well and say, if donor A can only ever give you $100 and donor B can give you 10 million, you do a disservice to your mission by not focusing more time, energy, and effort on donor B. And so I think we have to set up a system and a structure that allows us to do that well, even at some level of scale, because some organizations might have thousands of donors who can give significant gifts. But if all they ever do is put them in a mechanized fundraising program where they get, the same sort of rote direct mail experience and email experience as every other donor, and it never moves to the point of inviting them into a personal relationship, you're never going to move the needle.
So do you see organizations being ready to make that change and do things that are more substantial with individual relationships, even in direct response, even across the base of the pyramid? Because we just came through, this is going to date this episode of the podcast, unfortunately, Andrew, but we just came through the giving season, the big giving season in the US. And I know that I think I received my first physical letter with a postscript on it yesterday, and nothing from any other organization except for digital receipts. And this doesn't matter if I've given them a small contribution or I've given them what for me is a larger contribution and I know is potentially maybe in the top 5% of their donor pool. And so I'm thinking about it rationally as a person in our profession, but I'm experiencing it as a person. And I'm not, at least personally, experiencing yet organizations sending me these letters with postscripts or giving me a phone call or doing anything else that shows that they know that I'm human.
Yeah, and you're unfortunately not alone in that. I think that what I'm talking about, a lot of organizations are starting to talk about, and I think it starts with the conversation of, we need to focus more on retention than on acquisition, right? That's the easy kind of low-hanging fruit in this dialogue.
Right.
But what I find interesting is that conversation very rarely progresses to action, because it's a lot easier and it feels a lot better to add new to an organization than to keep existing. Right? For a number of reasons. I think humans are just wired psychologically to have a preference for new, different, that kind of thing. So there's a natural inclination to focus in those areas, and it can be harder. Like it's very easy to turn on the spigot, if you will, and bring new names into a donor file. It's a lot harder to do the things that are required to keep somebody once you've already they've already made that first gift. And it often impacts more areas of your business organizationally than just bringing a new name in. For example, when we talk about a donor journey and donor experience, a lot of people think, well, that just means I have to have an annual calendar for my mailings and my emails, and I have to make sure that there's continuity. But in reality, donor experience is everything. It's the way they experience your brand before they make a first gift. Mm-hmm. It's how they experience your follow-up after. It's what their experience is when they call your office. Do they get an automated phone tree that takes 20 minutes and makes them feel like they're trying to schedule a DMV appointment? Or do they get a warm human being that says, hey, thanks so much for giving us a call. How can I serve you today? Right? That is like, that kind of conversation right there can be foundational in retaining and bonding a donor to an organization, and nobody's paying attention to it.
Right.
So, until an organization is actually willing to move beyond the sort of generality and platitude of saying, oh, yes, we have to focus more on retention, and actually start to put budget and priority and strategy against that to drive meaningfully different outcomes, I don't think they're going to be ready for what I'm talking about. But there are some organizations that, and I interact with a lot, who say, there's got to be a better way for us to do this. We are tired of just churning through names and beating up our donors and asking, I've worked with organizations that in their direct mail program alone mail 50, 60, 70 times a year, and some that have even more emails going out, and they do that because they're at some level addicted to the gross revenue that it it drives, right? There's board expectations, there's C-level expectations, there's departmental goals that are triggered off of that gross revenue. And so they can't even think of the idea of giving up some of that gross revenue and getting smaller so that their net can get bigger and they can actually put more money to mission. And a case in point, I was counseling a very large national nonprofit brand. They've been around for dozens of decades, and they raise somewhere in the neighborhood of $26 million a year in their mail program, but they spend $22 million to get there. And so my team and I did an analysis on this, and we sat with them and we said, okay, this is insane. Like there's nothing about this program that puts you in a healthy position to grow and actually deliver on mission, because so much of your net is going back into the coffers of the printers and the postal service and the list buyers and the marketing agencies. You've got to change your philosophy here. You've got to even in the first year, let's take a couple of $1 million and let's put that in headcount and put people around the country. Because by the way, you have over 300,000 active supporters. And we've done the analysis, and we can tell you who in that file has capacity to give you more and is close enough to you that you could probably meaningfully impact the relationship in the next 12 months. And they listened intently and they nodded their heads in all the right places. And then they simply said, well, that's not how our model's built. And we're not comfortable with the idea of reducing our mail volume and what that does to our cost per piece and what it does to our efficiencies. So we're just not going to do it. And if we can't get out of our own ways, we're not going to fix this. But I am confident that there are organizations who acknowledge and who are starting to take the steps necessary to do this differently in the future.
You've been working at disruption a lot in this sector, because some of the things you're saying are both logical, but then they do run counter to the norms, just like that example.
Yep.
So is that the kind of thing that you're working on now with your new role?
It is. So I made this move, goodness, it's almost 90 days ago now, with really two goals in mind. I wanted to get back to working directly with clients that are engaging with high net worth donors, mm-hmm. and be able to move the needle on some really big, really important campaigns across the country. And then I also, so Derek Baker, who's the founder and CEO of DickersonBakker, he and I have worked closely together for a long time, and we both, from different kind of ends of the pyramid, if you will, have been pulling at this thread of there's got to be a better way to do this. And there's got to be a better way for organizations, even internally, to manage their direct response fundraising and their major gifts programs and not have conflict at the center of that. Mm-hmm. And so when we decided to formally link up and for me to join the team, it was with the explicit objective of building a different kind of agency that actually meets the kind of objectives that I just laid out for you.
Does it allow you to still sink your teeth into working with organizations that may at first be resistant? And the reason I'm asking that is that there is a through line that I'm hearing as you describe your whole life so far. And one of them is working in these organizations that had this kind of impact. I mean, you talked about almost going into the military, and I see you've served on the board of a veterans group, and you've mm-hmm. talked about your own experience with homelessness in your life, and certainly being around people who were on the edge in the neighborhood where you grew up. And you have served for several years on an organization working with, on the board of an organization working with the homeless. Will you, through this kind of approach, not just at the firm, but generally with this approach you're taking to the work, be able to help those kinds of organizations to do what they need to do so that fewer people are on the streets and more people can, have that experience out of the military that really brings them to where they need and want to be with the care that they need and deserve?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. So, I believe that there are really two callings on my life. And one is to help end as much suffering as possible while I'm on this earth. So that allows me and really motivates me every day to find the kind of organizations that you're talking about, and to create ways to add value to what they're doing. And so, I do think, and we're already sort of in the mix with organizations like that, partly because those are the kind of organizations that Dickerson-Bakker already served, groups like the Salvation Army, like rescue missions across the country, global ministry organizations that are dealing with people who are living in crisis and things of that nature. And so whether it's professionally in that way with organizations or personally in a volunteer capacity, like I do serving on the board of Downrange Warriors, I am looking for ways to add and create value that helps organizations mitigate as much suffering as possible. And I think, the model that I'm outlining here and where we're headed organizationally can work for just about any kind of organization. I don't think it's cause specific, but it does require a different level of leadership vision and a willingness for the organization and the people in the organization to kind of embrace a different way of thinking about philanthropy and move from the idea of easy transaction to relationship engagement.
As you talk about all these things, it strikes me that there's a lot of chaos in the world that I guess we all work in, but particularly that you've chosen. It's the chaos of the detail of these data files and trying to figure out where the opportunities are and get people to focus on the right things and trying to convince people to do what they need to do, not only to raise the revenue, but build relationships and grow the organization and get that net and all these other things. And it also means getting the business and convincing people to stay and all these other things that you do. And then you've chosen, the fast lane here, but you've chosen the slow lane in your own life. What is that about? What brought you to Tennessee? Why did you decide to do that in the middle of all this chaos to choose this, what sounds like a more peaceful path?
Yeah. So it might sound peaceful, but in a minute, I'm going to share something else with you that'll make you laugh because it probably will sound not peaceful at that point. My wife and I, a long time ago, decided that we wanted to eventually own some land. And, I lived in areas where, often as a kid, and I was in an apartment building or a, duplex or something like that, where literally like if someone coughed on the other side of the wall, you could hear it. Right. And you could probably, hear which cigarette they had just lit and what bottle of, booze they had just opened quite clearly through the paper walls. And I remember a long time ago saying to my wife, like, eventually I want to live in a place where I can walk out on my front porch and not hear my neighbor. And also, when we decided to have children and we started to think about the kind of life we wanted for them, particularly, because of how we both grew up and just what we knew about ourselves and what we assumed about kids we would raise, is that we wanted to make sure that they had an opportunity to really experience life differently, and to get out of the day-to-day chaos and rat race of a big city and get out into the country. So that's really, kind of 15 years of progressive desire to do this in our relationship. And then finally having the opportunity during the pandemic to kind of pull a parachute and say, let's get out of here. Let's leave Minneapolis and go somewhere where we can make this a reality. So that's what got us down to Tennessee. And we spent a year in a tiny little apartment in Knoxville before we actually found a farm property. And so about a year ago, this past October, we moved on to a little farm in East Knoxville, right at the Knox and Sevier County lines, out near, for those who are somewhat knowledgeable about the Knoxville area, where we're basically right between Knoxville and Gatlinburg. And we now have, I counted this morning, 227 animals on this farm.
Oh,
and
wow.
That's the part that feels more chaotic than not, Jay.
Okay. So, what are you doing with all these animals?
Right now, just trying not to get overrun. No, we have over 100 chickens. And so when the weather's not cold, that means we're producing a lot of eggs. And so we're sharing those with the community. We're selling them. We're, all those kind of things. We do eat some of the animals on the property. So we raised turkeys in advance of Thanksgiving, and we're able to feed about 30 different families with their Thanksgiving turkey. We raise 2 different types of pigs here on the farm, and so we've been able to provide really high quality protein for the community in that respect as well, and for ourselves. And then we've got other animals just for fun. We've got a small herd of Nigerian dwarf goats that really aren't good for anything other than humor. One of them has learned to ring my Ring doorbell. So every once in a while I get a nice video call on my phone from the goat. Which is great in like client presentations. It's been a lot of fun. And then we've got ducks, we've got Jersey cattle, we've got guinea hens, we've got geese, and then we've got 5 dogs.
So is this what you imagined it would be like? And what does your wife say about it now that you've gone down this path?
It is not at all what I imagined it like. When I first thought about being out, on a little bit of land, I imagined, myself, my wife, our kids, maybe 1 or 2 dogs and a good cup of coffee. And now that is, there's certainly more than that. My wife loves it. And I'm not going to say it's not hard, right? There are certain days when we're both like, oh my goodness, what have we gotten ourselves into? We had, I was telling somebody else a couple of days ago, we bought some pigs from a breeder in North Carolina last year. And when we first got them home, we put them within an electric fence. They're piglets at the time, and we thought, okay, we'll be perfect. We'll put them in this fence. They'll just lay down. We'll take care of them. We'll feed them. Within 45 seconds, they all blew through the fence and ran up a hill across the road, wow. and were lost for about 7 days. Oh, yeah. And we tried to chase them. It was a futile effort. All sorts of ridiculously. And we were like, we should just throw in the towel and sell this place and go back to a condo, but we fought our way through it. We ended up pushing the pigs back. My wife had a brilliant plan to put food all the way up, in little piles all the way up our driveway until we can get into a gated area. And eventually they did that, and we were able to sneak around the house and lock them back in so that we could keep them. But things like that happen. I got knocked over by a cow a couple of days ago. Our goats will come and destroy something every other day. My wife and I joke about it. I take pictures of it now, and I send it to her, and I say, I just want you to know your goats cost us another $50, and here's the picture, here's the proof. So things like that happen. But at the same time, I see the level of responsibility that my girls are able to take in caring for the animals and caring for the farm, and the pride they're able to have by being, knowing that, my 11-year-old, for example, can fully manage a 600-pound steer at this point, and that's something that most kids her age are never going to experience. And I think it gives her an advantage to know that she's capable of that kind of thing. And at the same time, just being able to be out in the land and messing around and getting muddy and not worrying about what's going on in the city, I think it's really good for them. And so on balance, for all the things that make it hard, the positives still outweigh it.
What's the biggest surprise in all of that for you so far?
The biggest surprise in all of it has been, I think for me, how bothered I get by mess. I didn't expect it. And there's a lot of mess on a farm. And I find myself having to fight daily this idea of like having nice, clean, neat structure when really it is just chaos every day.
It's so funny because it sounds like professionally you've been trying to bring order to chaos ever since you left LA. And you have created chaos and maybe in an effort to control it right there on the farm, but also to bring this wonderful, rich experience for you and for your family, a very natural experience. I'm wondering, when you look back and you think about when you were a kid there with your parents and all the challenges that they had and that you experienced with them, what that kid would think about what you're doing now, and maybe also what your parents would think about what you're doing now.
Yeah. I think depending on sort of what stage of life, that kid would probably go somewhere between, what in the world are you doing, you idiot? And wow, that's really cool, right? I mean, there's definitely chaos here, but as I think about kind of how I grew up in the chaos that we lived in then, the really big difference, to whatever extent is humanly possible, is we have a lot more control over the chaos here than I did as a kid in the chaos in our lives. Recognizing that ultimately I'm not truly in control of anything. That, the day-to-day control that I can exercise over what happens on the farm is a lot different than what I was able to, exercise as a kid with my mom trying to figure out, where we're going to get our next meal. So that's I think my thought there. As far as my parents, my dad passed before he was able to visit here and experience any of this, but my mom was just out middle of last year and spent a full week with us here, and I think her first reaction was overwhelm and we must be insane to have all these animals and everything, but she's already planning her next visit and wants to come back, because I think she even enjoyed chasing the pigs and chasing the cows and having the ability to be out in really what is a very natural habitat, and experience the grandkids in that way. And so I think she's quite pleased with what she saw here, and just, enjoys being able to spend time with the kids outside.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of this, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Jay, I appreciate the invitation and really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks again for making it possible.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.